Hi, my name is John, and this is the video lecture for the Linguistic Ecology of Pigeons and Creoles. Here on your screen, this is a visual representation of the world's 3,000 or so endangered languages. Endangered in the sense that based on current conditions, it's possible and sometimes probable that within the foreseeable future, these languages will not be spoken anymore, right? That 3,000 or so currently endangered languages is out of a total of about 6,000 to 7,000 languages spoken around the world. Um, and there's a lot of different predictions about how language loss is going to proceed over the next 100 or so years. Um, in the most extreme, kind of dire predictions about language loss in the 21st century, some people project that 90% of the current 6,000 to 7,000 languages spoken in the world will not be spoken anymore. But if you do the math on that, it's a far cry from a world where everyone is speaking one single global language like English, right? 90% gone would still leave something like 600 to 700 languages spoken around the world. And what that means is that language shift in many parts of the world is not experienced as a shift from a small local language straight to a big international language, um, but instead from a small local language to what is oftentimes only a slightly larger regional or national language. Um, in many regions, especially in some parts of the Pacific and sub-Saharan Africa, um, uh, the regional and national languages that are taking in speakers from small local languages are a sort of special class of human languages that we call Pidgins and Creoles. So in this video, we're going to talk about what Pidgins and Creoles are. We're going to talk about how they form, and we're going to talk about how the particular linguistic ecologies or language environments that they form in lead to them playing an important role in language shift and language loss around the world. So in this video, I'm going to define that term I just mentioned, linguistic ecology. We're going to define Pidgins and Creoles, and then we're going to look at one particular Pacific Creole, a language called Pisin, which is spoken in the country of Papua New Guinea. And we're going to look at why Pisin poses a particular threat to the existence of that country's 800 or so indigenous languages. Let's get started. Um, Linguistic ecology contains the term ecology, which if you've ever taken a life science course like biology or environmental science, you might be familiar with. And you might know something about it that like ecology means the study of ecosystems, right? That ecology means studying the relationships between different organisms and understanding how they build a larger system of interaction in the natural world, right? So just as an example, right, if you take a particular ecosystem like the forest at the back of Manoa, which if you've never been and hiked around back there, you definitely should. If you were some kind of life scientist, there's lots of things that you could study back in the forest at the back of Manoa. If you were a botanist, you might pick a particular tree species and you might want to know about its organic chemistry, like the chemical compounds that it creates in its leaves or the structure of its roots, right? If you were an ornithologist, you could look at lots of different bird species and you could pick one and study its mating behaviors or its social interactions or how it gets food, right? What it does and doesn't eat. But if you are an ecologist, you're not so much looking at like any one particular organism or any one particular type of organism. You're actually kind of looking at the forest as a whole. And what that means is that you're looking at how different living organisms interact with one another and how those series of interactions, those relationships between different organisms, create a larger system that propagates not only the individual living organisms, but the system as a whole, right? How it's maintained over time. So that's what ecology is, right, in life sciences, very simply. It's a study of relationships between organisms. And we can kind of take that idea and apply it to languages as well. Not exactly perfectly, because languages are not living organisms, right? Languages are things that humans do. So the metaphor isn't exactly perfect. But the basic idea of looking at different languages that are spoken in a place and seeing how they fill different roles, right, similar to environmental or ecological niches, and the relationships they have to one another. If we look at that, then it's kind of similar to ecology, right? So just to give you an example of what a linguistic ecology might look like, here in Honolulu, we've got a ton of different languages spoken. This is a very linguistically diverse place, right? We have obviously English that we're speaking right now. There's Pidgin, there's Olelo Hawaii or the Hawaiian language. There's Philippine languages like Ilocano or Tagalog. There's East Asian languages like Korean, Japanese, a couple of different Chinese languages. You have Southeast Asian languages like Thai or Vietnamese. There's many Pacific languages aside from Hawaiian. They're spoken in Honolulu like Samoan or Tongan. There's Micronesian languages like Chuukese or Pohnpeian. I could really keep going down the list. There's a huge number of different languages that are spoken here. But what you probably notice as I'm listing them off is that these languages are, in a way, not exactly equal in Honolulu. And I'm not saying that one language is like any better than any other, but obviously, for example, in a university course like this one, this video is being done in English, not in Korean or Hawaiian. So all of these languages that are spoken in Honolulu are equally good as like communication systems. They're all equally good tools for cultural transmission or ways to establish and maintain communities, right? But they're spoken in different places and they have different statuses relative to one another, and they kind of play different roles in the broader community. And so an understanding of those relationships between languages, how they differ within a given environment, that's really the core of linguistic ecology. So for example, in Honolulu, English sticks out a lot, right? Because it is the language of socioeconomic prestige, yeah? It's the language that the government speaks. It's the language of education. It's the language of most major economic activity that goes on in the city, right? If you want to get into a kind of position of power, some kind of position of political or economic power in Honolulu, you're probably going to have to do it through English, yeah? Now, you can compare that to like the way that Hawaiian is used in Honolulu. It's also an official language of the state, right? Hawaii has two official languages, English and Hawaiian, but they're used very differently, right? Most people, almost, majority of people in Honolulu speak English, whereas very few people are fluent speakers of Hawaiian, right? That's changing with the revitalization program and the growth of a new generation of first language speakers. But at the moment, there's not really that many people that speak Hawaiian, right? Its use is very visible, right? We see it on street signs, names of buildings. It's a very visible language, but something like its official status is kind of more a matter of symbolism or recognition of Hawaiian people than it is a practical matter of like a need to communicate to the public in Hawaiian, right? We can look at other languages like Japanese or Ilocano and Chuukese, which are spoken in various communities in the city. And we can compare them in terms of things like, what's the average income of a speaker of one of these languages, because they're going to be different, right? And so, for example, speakers of Japanese tend to be in the higher socioeconomic class than speakers of like Chuukese, for example, right? And that affects the way that the languages get used and the attitudes that people have towards the languages, right? There's discrimination against languages like Chuukese sometimes in a way that there is not against languages like Japanese. So this is what we mean by linguistic ecology, right? Just trying to break down and understand differences between languages that are spoken in a particular place and how they relate to one another. And a really important point about linguistic ecologies is that they're not fixed. They can change over time. And I'll give you a relatively simple example of that. This is the country of Papua New Guinea. We're going to talk a little bit more about Papua New Guinea later on. But one of the largest kind of outlying islands off of mainland Papua New Guinea is the island of New Britain. And the kind of historical capital of New Britain is this town up at the northeast corner called Rabaul. We'll come back to Rabaul in a minute. But this island of New Britain, before European colonists got to Papua New Guinea, had something like 60 or so different indigenous languages. Yeah, counting is kind of fuzzy sometimes, but around 60 different languages. And the linguistic ecology of this place traditionally was what we would say was very egalitarian. It was very equal. And what that means is that of these 60 or so languages, there wasn't one language that was like the dominant language. And that's because there was no single group of people that had like political control over the rest of the island, right? So all of these languages had more or less the same number of speakers. There wasn't a huge variation in the speaker number. And they were all just spoken within a handful of villages. And none of them was more like politically or economically important than any other, except for the fact that just when you were in a particular village, you were expected to speak the language of that village. And that all changed when Europeans showed up, right? So I mentioned this place, Rabaul, up at the northeast tip of the island. When the first European colonists got there, it was the Germans who showed up in the 1880s, and they established their colonial capital here at this place called Rabaul, which, as you can tell in this picture of the town, has this nice, big, natural enclosed bay, right? It's geographically, it's perfect for a capital city that you're going to have like a port in. You're going to be trading in and out of. You're going to have people coming in and out from overseas. So the Germans picked this place as their capital, and this place just happens to have one of the 60 different languages of the island of New Britain spoken on it, which is a language called Tolai. Goes by a couple other names, including Kuanoa. But again, Tolai, before the Germans showed up in the Tolai-speaking area, was not particularly more important than any other language of the region. But once the Germans were there and Tolai all of a sudden was now the language of the capital, it became a prestigious language, right? It was the language of people who were getting jobs in the colonial government. It was the language that missionaries were starting to use to preach to native people there on the island of New Britain. And so you go from a situation prior to European colonization where all the languages are roughly equal in size and equal in status, a situation where today Tolai is actually a pretty important regional language. It has far and away more speakers than any other language on the island. And some of the neighboring languages next to Tolai are actually pretty close to being gone. A couple of them are very severely endangered with less than 100 speakers. So the point here is that when the political or economic environment changes, that can lead to a change in linguistic ecology, such that one language goes from being equal with everybody else to all of a sudden being like a prestige language, while other languages are kind of losing speakers. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about linguistic ecology and what we mean when we talk about linguistic ecology, let's look at the next topic, pigeons and creoles. So first things first, Pidgin and Creole are actually technical terms within linguistics. And they are also in some of the names of different languages around the world, right? So for example, here in Hawaii, we have people who speak Pidgin, right? But that's the name of the language here in Hawaii, but the technical terms that we use in linguistics don't necessarily match up with the names that people give to languages. So for example, Pidgin in Hawaii is by the technical linguistic definition is a Creole language, which is why you get books like this here, Kent Sakota and Jeff Siegel's Pidgin Grammar, subtitle, An Introduction to the Creole Language of Hawaii. So don't necessarily assume that something that is called a pigeon is always going to be a pigeon by the technical definition we have in linguistics. So what Pidgins and Creoles are fundamentally is an extreme form of language contact, or an extreme product of language contact. And language contact just refers to any kind of interaction between speakers of two or more different languages that leads to some kind of observable change in one or more of the languages that are involved with one another. So, a really common example, and one that's really easy to see and understand, is the idea of a loan word. A loan word is a word in one language which comes from another language, right? So just as an example, in English, we have a handful of words that originally come from the Nahuatl language, which was the language of the Aztecs in the Aztec Empire. And that would be words like tomato and avocado and chocolate and a handful of other ones. And we have these words that are originally from the Nahuatl language because the words for those things came into Spanish when Spanish people showed up in the Aztec Empire and saw foods that they had never seen before. They, kind of ask, what is this? And they just call it whatever the Aztec people are calling it, right? So we get words from Aztec through the Spanish for foods that were introduced to Europeans by Aztecs, right? So the idea of a loan word is pretty easy, right? You find something new, you want to know what to call it, and you just take the word from another language that already has a word for it. Yeah. There's other effects though that language content can have on a language. There can be grammatical effects. One example is that in the old English of the like 5th to 10th century AD, English was a language that was a little bit more like modern German, where when you put together sentences, sometimes you have the subject and then the verb and then the object, like I eat the sandwich, and sometimes you have something else, which is the subject and the object and the verb. So something like I, the sandwich, eat, right? That you would have kind of different word orders. That was in very old English. And then in the year 1066, speakers of a version of French invaded England, took it over, and were the people in charge for several centuries. And so that contact between speakers of this type of French and Old English led to a change in the Old English grammar, such that it looked more like French, which was exclusively a subject, verb, object language. And that's why the modern English we speak today is only subject, verb, object. And we never have sentences that have the subject followed by the object, then the verb. So language context can affect hypothetically any part of a language, right? The vocabulary, the grammar, the sound system. You can see lots of different effects. But usually the effects reflect, to some degree or another, the nature of the interaction between the speakers that are involved. So a good example of this is comparing the effect of Japanese on English to the effect of English on Japanese. Yeah, English and Japanese are two languages which have been in pretty strong contact with one another for, you know, what, something like a couple hundred years since the opening of Japan. And there are effects on both sides, right? We have a handful of loan words in English that are from Japanese. Some of them are things that most English speakers would recognize as being Japanese words because they're Japanese things, right? Like sushi or kimono. Probably some of these words, an average English speaker would not recognize them as being Japanese. So like tsunami, a lot of English speakers probably don't realize that that's a Japanese word originally. But the vast majority of these loan words from Japanese into English represent things that are like Japanese cultural items, usually like food or clothing or cultural practices or ideas, right? And that looks very different on the other side, right? There is way more borrowing of English words into Japanese than the other way around. And the borrowing of English words into Japanese is not limited to things like foods or particular like cultural items or objects, right? Obviously, you have Japanese words like hamburger for hamburger, but you also have the use of just a massive number of English words in all different kinds of domains, right? Here's an example of a few interesting ones. So like the word image, right? That's not a particular English cultural object, right? And yet Japanese speakers have taken that word from English and use it in a slightly different meaning in Japanese. You have certain combinations of words, so like TV remote control, you have like remocon, like remote control. But the core of the vocabulary is coming from English, right? Even though it's being cut up and used in a slightly different way. So this difference, this fact that Japanese is borrowed a lot more from English than English is borrowed from Japanese, is reflective of the history of the interaction between those two groups of people, right? Since World War II, especially, English speakers, primarily Americans, have had a lot bigger impact on like the economy of Japan than Japanese speakers have had on the economy of the U.S., right? And it's because of the kind of economic imbalance that was created at the end of the Second World War. And so that is reflected in this difference in effect that the two languages have on one another. The fact that there's so many more loan words from English and Japanese than from Japanese in English. So language contact can affect all different parts of grammar, and its effects on languages usually reflect the type of interaction that speakers have with one another. So Pidgins and Creoles, then, to get back to our topic, represent kind of an extreme form of language contact, one that leads to the creation of a whole new language, right? So interaction between Japanese and English speakers had a lot of effects. especially on Japanese. But it didn't lead to the production of a distinct third language separate from Japanese and English. But that's exactly what happens with a pidgin or a Creole. And there's an order here. When first a pidgin language develops as a product of language contact, and then the pidgin becomes a Creole. So we're going to talk about pidgins here first. Pidgins typically form in a linguistic ecology where you have speakers of several different languages in some kind of close, regular contact with another, usually for a particular purpose, usually an economic one, like plantation work or trade or mining operations, that kind of thing. And in these environments, the need arises for some kind of common means of communication amongst a multilingual workforce. This particular kind of like close contact multilingual scenario has been really, really common in the economies that have been created by European colonialism and also by globalization over the past several hundred years. So let's start with just the local example of the early English-based pidgin that developed in Hawaii in the 19th century. In the mid-19th to early 20th century, English-speaking planters from the U.S. had established sugar plantations here in Hawaii, and the sugar plantations drew workers from a whole bunch of different places. Obviously, there were local speakers of Hawaiian or Hawaii who worked on these plantations, but they also drew labor from lots of other different places and speech communities. So, like the first people from abroad to come and work the sugar plantations were mostly speakers of Cantonese from southern China and speakers of Portuguese from Portuguese islands like Madeira and the Azores. And then later you had people from places like Korea, the Philippines, Japan, and Okinawa, all coming to the plantations and bringing their own language with them. And the most common shared linguistic experience that all these speakers of many different languages had was their experience with English, which was the language of socioeconomic power in the sugar plantation economy, because the planters, the people in charge, spoke English. So speakers of all these different languages were taking English vocabulary that they were familiar with and used it to form a simplified version of English, a simplified language for communication on the sugar plantation. So this simplified language mostly contained vocabulary based on English words, but its grammar was heavily influenced by the grammars of people's first languages, so like Hawaiian or Cantonese, and took a good number of words from these languages as well. So this simplified English with heavy grammatical influence and some words from Hawaiian, Cantonese, and other languages of the sugar plantations, this was a pidgin. So now a pidgin, by our linguistic definition, has no native speakers and is very restricted in its use. So this early plantation pidgin in Hawaii in the mid-19th century wasn't something that anyone really spoke like at home. They only used it as a means of communication on the plantation when they were working. So this means that it was mostly limited in what it could express to things that were related to work on the plantations. So when we say that a pidgin is by definition a simplified language, this really is like the core of what we mean, that it is simple because it is used in a very restricted context for a particular purpose. And it isn't really meant for like living your life in. Now there are like grammatical components to simplicity as well, right? It's not just the fact that pidgins are used in a restricted domain or place. You have things like the sound system is usually simpler than whatever the primary language that the pidgin is based off of is. For example, in English, which was the main language that was a shared experience of speakers of pidgin, we have a ton of vowels, right? English vowels are numerous, a lot more than 5, and they are kind of complex, right? So just this is a basic example of a word like boat in kind of standard American English. The vowel actually moves, right? It goes bo, o, o, o. And that's kind of a weird sound if it's not a sound that your language normally makes, right? And in Chinese or Hawaiian or Filipino languages, several of the other languages of plantation workers on the Hawaii sugar plantations, that particular sound was a little bit unusual. It wasn't like part of their languages normally. And so English or American English boat kind of came into pidgin boat, right? You have a flat O sound, which is more like the way that an O is pronounced in a lot of the languages that people were speaking as first languages on the plantations. You also get things like restricted vocabulary a lot of the time. So again, you want something that is very simple and functional for people to use because they just need to communicate and get things done, right? So the vocabulary that you're going to use usually in a pidgin is kind of small compared to any of the other languages that are in use. So for example, in English, we have different words for different kinds of chickens, right? We have a base word chicken, but then we have a hen, which is a female chicken. We've got a rooster, which is a male chicken. We have a chick, which is a baby chicken. We even have like some specialized terminology, like a capon is a chicken, a male chicken that's been castrated. That's way too many words, right? And they're only used for like one thing. A pidgin wants a small set of words that can be used for lots of different things. So in the pidgin language, you're going to have something more like one word chicken, and then you'll say something like boy chicken, girl chicken, baby chicken, right? Because boy, girl, baby, those are multiple, those have a lot more uses than just talking about chickens, right? You can talk about any kind of sex or gender using those terms. And so that's another component of simplicity, that pidgins tend to have small vocabularies and words that they can put together to create new ideas, but still based on a small restricted vocabulary. So plantation workers in Hawaii, of course, end up settling down here and have kids. And over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, that plantation pidgin ended up making its way home. And eventually people started using it to raise their kids. So when a pidgin language becomes the first language of a group of people, they kind of, in a sense, fill it out. People use the basic building blocks of the pidgin that was developed on the plantations in this restricted work domain, and they develop ways of talking about anything that they want to. So the pidgin goes from being simplified and restricted to being fully fleshed out. As I said earlier, it becomes a language that people live their whole lives in. And when the pidgin makes this transition to being the first language of a group of people, then it is what we technically call a Creole. And this is why the Hawaii pidgin spoken today in Hawaii is technically a Creole, because it is the first language of a whole big group of people who can use it to talk about anything that they want to. So a Creole language is not any simpler than any other natural first language of any group of people, right? So it's no more simple than English or Cantonese or Swahili or Cherokee. It's just a language that historically descends from a pidgin. So that is the basic definitions of those two terms. A pidgin is a simplified language that develops as a means of communication in close multilingual contact, and it's not anyone's native language. When a pidgin is then brought into a community fully and you raise children in it and you have it as the first language of a group of people, then it becomes a Creole, which is a language created when a pidgin becomes the first language of a community, and it is fully functional and non-restrictive. So if you want to understand pidgins and Creoles just a little bit better, think about this question. Why didn't workers on the sugar plantations of Hawaii in the 19th century just learn to speak English, right? Why did they develop a whole new pidgin language instead? Well, it's because even though language was the folks of people in power, and it was the language that everyone had some kind of shared direct contact with, it was not the first language of the vast majority of people that were actually working day in and day out on the plantations. So in a pidgin formation, there's usually what we call a lexifier language, which is the language usually of prestige that contributes most of the vocabulary of a pidgin language, right? Usually the language of the most socially dominant group, which is what English speakers were on the Hawaii sugar plantations. And you have native speakers of like Hawaiian and Cantonese and Portuguese and other languages in the fields, basically communicating with one another in, using the little bit of shared English that they knew, but with heavy influence from their different first languages. First language English speakers weren't actually around all that much during the day-to-day operations. So in a way, a pidgin language, like a pidgin in Hawaii, is kind of like what happens when a bunch of second language speakers of a language use it amongst themselves instead of with first language speakers of that particular language. So the social conditions for the creations of pidgins and Creoles, like I said, have been really abundant in the world and in the economic conditions that have been created by European colonialism and globalization. So for example, in big port cities around the world, which over the last 500 years have had a tendency to attract workers from a really wide area, simplified pidgin languages based on big languages of commerce like English or Portuguese have developed among diverse populations of traders. So like the Pidgin English that was used in Chinese ports in like the 1600s to recently as early 1900s is actually where the word pigeon probably comes from. It's an adaptation of the English word for business within a Chinese pidgin. In Sri Lanka, long-term Portuguese trading led to the development of a language called Sri Lankan Portuguese Creole, which still has native speakers today. Think, if you will, for the example, think about the linguistic environment of early slave plantations in the Americas. You had speakers of many different unrelated West African languages forced to work and live together in these environments. And one of the primary linguistic experiences these speakers of different languages had was that they all had some interaction with the languages of those in power, which would have been like English in the American South, or French in Haiti, or Portuguese in Brazil. And the Pidgins and later Creoles that developed in these environments gave rise to a lot of numerous important Creole languages that are still spoken today. So like Haitian Creole is the national language of Haiti. It's a French-based Creole. Creole languages from slave plantations are actually the historical origin of some varieties of English that are spoken today in African-American communities. Now in the 20th and 21st centuries, rapid globalization and urbanization is creating new contexts for Pidgin and Creole formation, as people from small rural communities which speak small local or indigenous languages move to big cities where they end up speaking Pidgin and Creole languages as second language speakers. So if we think about a country like Nigeria, which is a very linguistically diverse place, there's over 400 different local languages. People from small villages with their own local languages will move to larger cities, and they become wage earners, and they become part of a labor force of other people who have also moved from their own small villages with their own small local languages. And these people in this multilingual workforce that looks a lot like the plantation economy of 19th century Hawaii, they develop their own functional Pidgin languages that they use to communicate. And sometimes they even adapt already existing Creole languages that exist before they get there, like Nigerian Creole English, which acts as like a lexifier of a new Pidgin, right? And you almost have like this unending cycle that happens where certain conditions create a Pidgin that becomes a Creole, and that Creole then becomes the lexifier for a new Pidgin language, right? The formation of Pidgins and Creoles is something that can be kind of cyclical, right? History never stops. So in other words, the linguistic ecologies that led to the development of Pidgins and Creoles in places like Hawaii sugar plantations or slave plantations in the Caribbean, these linguistic ecologies are actually getting more and more common as the global economy becomes more and more flat and urbanization continues to accelerate. Okay, so in the final section of this video, we're going to think about these two topics, linguistic ecology and contact languages, in the context of a particular case study, which is the Tok Pisin language of Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, which is the country in red here on the map, is the most linguistically diverse country in the world, at least in terms of the number of languages that are spoken. There's over 800 different languages that are indigenous to Papua New Guinea. And yet, despite this huge linguistic diversity, the government only reserves some kind of official status for 3 spoken languages: English, an indigenous contact language that's called Hirimotu, and a third English-based Creole, which is called Tok Pisin, literally Tok Pigeon. That's what Tok Pisin means literally. Of these 3 languages that have some kind of official status, it's only Tok Pisin that can be considered a true national language of Papua New Guinea. Even though less than 200,000 people in the country speak Tok Pisin as a first language, it's a second language of a majority of the country's 8 million or so citizens. So we have 2 basic questions that I want to answer in this part of the video about Tok Pisin, which are interesting to the discussion of contact languages and language ecology. First question: why in such a massively linguistically diverse country like Papua New Guinea has this one single particular language become so widespread across the whole country? And second, why is it that it is an English-based Creole that has become so widespread and not just English? So first, on the way towards answering those 2 questions, let's understand a little bit about why Papua New Guinea is such a linguistically diverse place to begin with. So the island of New Guinea, which is the 2nd largest island in the world, sits above Australia, is one of the like oldest sites of human habitation outside of Africa anywhere in the world. Humans have just been there a really, really long time. They the first migrants to settle the island of New Guinea probably got there so long ago that it was during the last ice age, when the sea levels around the world were so low that New Guinea was actually connected to the Australian mainland. They formed a single contiguous landmass. The descendants of those early migrants that got to New Guinea back, at the end of the last ice age, they speak what linguists refer to today as Papuan languages. We group them together and call them all Papuan languages. They likely are all descendants of a single language or a group of languages that was spoken by those first migrants to the island of New Guinea, all those 40,000+ years ago. But they've actually been there for so long, and they have diversified so much that linguistic science can't actually prove that they are related to one another, even if we think based on genetic and archaeological records that they probably are. And just for some comparison, the oldest language families that we can actually reconstruct, like the Indo-European language family in Europe or the Austronesian language family in the Pacific, those only go back about 6,000 or 7,000 years. So trying to reconstruct a language back 40,000 years is really outside of the scope of linguistic science. So one of the reasons there's so many languages in Papua New Guinea is because you have this group of Papuan people who've been there so long that the languages have just diversified a lot. Another major migration to New Guinea happened much more recently, probably about 3,000 or so years ago, as speakers of Austronesian languages settled the coastal parts of the island. Now, Austronesian languages were spread all over the Pacific during the Austronesian migration, which started in Taiwan, and then Austronesian-speaking peoples settled the islands of the Philippines and the Indonesian archipelago before moving out towards New Guinea, settling the coastal areas, and eventually from there spreading out and colonizing the Pacific, Polynesia and Micronesia. So the island of New Guinea today is a very linguistically diverse place with over like 1,000 languages, some of them Papuan, some of them Austronesian. In some cases you have languages that are kind of somewhere in between, or they have a lot of influence from Austronesian and Papuan languages. So there's just this huge number of different local languages, most of them just small languages spoken in a handful of villages around the island. These indigenous languages are referred to in Tok Pisin as Tok place, meaning something like talk specific to a place, which is a reference to the fact that the languages themselves are usually just spoken in a particular handful of villages in a small geographic area. So as we discussed earlier in the video when we were talking about Tolai and Rabaul, in broader Melanesia, of which New Guinea is a part, the traditional linguistic ecology was very egalitarian. Most languages were kind of a relatively equal status to one another, and there's no evidence that there were ever like major dominant languages that were associated with like conquering empires on the island of New Guinea. But that all changed with the advent of colonization by European powers, which started in the 19th century. Colonization of New Guinea has seen control of various parts of the island at different times by lots of different people, including the Germans, the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Americans fought on New Guinea during World War II. The British and the Australians have had control over much of the eastern part of the island. And since the mid-20th century, the island has been split in two, with the western half being part of Indonesia, which gained its independence after World War II. And the eastern half, along with some of the outlying islands, that is the modern country of Papua New Guinea. So part of this history of colonization and the political changes that have gone on since colonization of New Guinea is a practice that was known as blackbirding, which lasted from the 19th to early 20th centuries. And it was a practice where colonists, mostly British people, would go around different islands of Melanesia or the South Pacific, and either by force or through like false promises or some kind of coercion, would take people from their home islands to go work in different labor camps, mostly sugar plantations in Australia and Fiji. Although there were some other major economic operations like guano farming, which is basically bat poop on islands that was used as fertilizer. This process of basically taking forced labor from different parts of the South Pacific created a linguistic ecology in the work camps that these people were taken to that was, at this point, to be pretty familiar to us. You had workers from all over Melanesia speaking hundreds of different languages from across this very linguistically diverse region, and a single linguistic group, English speakers, who were in charge and giving orders. The Pidgin language that naturally developed in these work camps in Australia and Fiji and in other parts of the South Pacific is often referred to as Melanesian Pidgin, because most of its speakers, most of the people that developed it were from the Melanesian region. So when speakers of this Melanesian Pidgin left the work camps and returned back to their homes, they brought this Melanesian Pidgin back home with them, and it took off in a lot of places. It became a very popular means of communication between speakers of different languages. This kind of simplified Pidgin used for communication had a lot of practical value in many of these different parts of Melanesia where there's really a lot of linguistic diversity. In fact, we know that it's in part because of the linguistic diversity that it became so popular, because one of the groups of people that was involved in the formation of Melanesian Pidgin was actually people from Samoa. And Samoans, like other people that worked in these labor camps in the South Pacific, they took Melanesian Pidgin back home with them when they eventually made it back home. But Melanesian Pidgin didn't catch on in Samoa the way that it did in New Guinea or other parts of Melanesia. And that's probably because Samoa is a very ethnically homogenous, monolingual place. Pretty much the only language spoken there is Samoan. So Melanesian Pidgin developed and kind of shifted and changed shape over time as laborers were moved around to different places, and these political and economic affiliations changed and shifted over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. But in the eastern part of New Guinea, which eventually became the independent country of Papua New Guinea, it developed into a Pidgin language that was referred to as Pisin. And it's been spread throughout the country by a lot of different means. One of those means is urbanization. As cities have grown and drawn in speakers of many different languages from across the multilingual countryside, Pisin has been a way for people to communicate with people whose native languages they are not familiar with. Urbanization in the country also means that people often live outside of the kind of traditional communities that they used to live in rural villages. And so children that would traditionally grow up speaking the Tok place or local language of their village, in the urban setting, you often have parents who speak two different languages, two different Tok place, and they raise their children just in Tok Pisin, right, which is kind of the neutral language of communication. And kids never learn from either of the parents their heritage language, their Tok place. In many urban centers, especially in the capital of the country, Port Moresby, there's significant populations who are monolingual just in Tok Pisin just for this very reason, right? You have people from different linguistic backgrounds that are getting married and having kids, and they raise them in this kind of neutral language of communication instead of any of their individual languages from their home villages. Another force that's kind of spread Tok Pisin around is Christian missionaries, which have been active in Papua New Guinea for quite a long time. And they've always found it easier to use Tok Pisin as a means of proselytizing, converting people, and with interacting with Papuans. It's easier to use Tok Pisin than it is to learn one of the many different Tok place, the local languages. And this has given Tok Pisin a lot of power in the domain of religion. The churches are also often associated with development projects. And that means that there's an association that Tok Pisin has, not just with the religious domain, but also there's some economic associations that come with that association with religion. Education policies in the country have always both responded to and have affected this complex linguistic ecology. The early view that colonial governments had of the great linguistic diversity of New Guinea was that it was basically a problem for governing the region, right? There's too many languages, we can't control people. And early on, the belief that colonists had was not only that all of these took place, these local languages were hard to govern in, but also that they didn't really want to teach a lot of people English, because that might give local Papuans, too much political power relative to the colonial governments. And so the teaching of English was often restricted, while Tok Pisin was used as a means to educate Papuan children in like a formal Western style education. Later on in the 20th century, the independent government of Papua New Guinea has seen English language education as a top priority, and a way for Papua New Guinea to get more involved in the global economy, right? Have more English speakers, we can be more involved in the global economy. But the fact of the matter is that PNG is a relatively underdeveloped and poor country, and most children have at most a few years of education. Since Tok Pisin is just more widely known and it's used in day-to-day life throughout the country, it's often the default primary language of education. And full English language education is usually reserved for a small percentage of Papuans who make it into higher levels of education, many of them belonging to the country's upper class. So there's restrictions about who has access to English just because of lack of resources. But the limited educational resources also mean that any kind of formal education or schooling in the Tok place, the local languages, is very minimal, if not completely non-existent. Now, finally, there's the way that the government thinks about both Tok place, about Tok Pisin, and about English. English is the official language in Papua New Guinea of the government, just because Papua New Guinea was previously a British colony and then it was an Australian protectorate before it became independent. So English was the language of the prior colonial government, and it maintained that position after independence. Nowadays, most government documents are actually produced in English, but like I said, most of the population does not achieve a high enough level of education to be able to speak or read functional English. And so things like public information campaigns are usually done in Tok Pisin. In other words, the government uses English to communicate amongst itself, but if it wants to communicate with the broader public, it does so in Tok Pisin. But Tok Pisin isn't just useful for communication from the government's point of view. It's also the closest thing to a language of national identity for Papuan people. All of these various Tok place have been somewhat controversial from the point of view of the government in the sense that they're associated with particular towns, particular family or clan groups, and therefore they have an association with a kind of tribalism and separatism that the government has often seen as a problem for like national unity in this very diverse place. Tok Pisin, on the other hand, can be seen as a language of national unity because it doesn't belong to any one particular ethnic or tribal or clan identity. English also has no particular like clan or ethnic identity. It's not related to any one particular group in the country, but there's kind of two reasons why English cannot be the national language that Tok Pisin is. One is just practical, like we've already mentioned, that so many people already speak Tok Pisin and there's just not enough educational infrastructure or resources to teach a similar number of people to speak English. But the other, perhaps, is a cultural reason. Tok Pisin is a language which was created and developed by Papuans and other Melanesian peoples, is full of vocabulary and constructions and ideas, really, that show its Melanesian identity and reflect Melanesian culture in a way that English really just cannot do. So to make those questions, to answer those questions that I posed at the beginning of this section, right? One, how has Tok Pisin become such a large, widespread language in such a linguistically diverse country? Well, it's become so widespread because it's a politically neutral language of communication in what is a very linguistically diverse country. Urbanization brings people into highly multilingual populations which desire to use Tok Pisin as a means of communication. And since it's associated with economic activity and social prestige, many view it as more practical and valuable than their local language, the Tok place. So whereas the Tok place were all historically on a relatively equal footing with one another, social and economic changes in the history of the country have led to a change in linguistic ecology, which favors the use of a language of wider communication, a role which Tok Pisin can fill. So the second question was, why is it an English-based Creole and not just English that has become the language of wider communication in the country? And that's largely the story of access. So Tok Pisin came into existence and developed among Papuans and other Melanesian peoples, and its spread has really kind of been organic. There's not like a top-down organization that's promoting Tok Pisin. People use it because some people speak it, and there is a need for a language of wider communication, and so it's spread organically, right? There's not an organization that is forcing its spread. English, as the historical language of these foreign colonial elites, right, is something which people don't often have access to, right? You have to have access to higher levels of education than most people do in the country. In other words, English is not really a language of wider communication for the people of Papua New Guinea, but rather just an elite language that only a select few have the privilege to gain access to. Now, this last point is really what I want to finish on. It's why Pidgins and Creoles are so important to modern language shift and loss and understanding language ecologies around the world in the 21st century. Globalization takes speakers of small local languages out of their local linguistic ecologies and moves them into an integrated economy with a multilingual, low-wage workforce. And this happens either because speakers move out of their small villages into urban centers, or in some cases, the kind of markets, the economic spheres of the urban centers grow to include the small towns. These new economies create new linguistic ecologies which require languages of wider communication. And in the absence of access to formal education in like a standard national language or an international language, people instead develop their own contact languages because they need one. And some of them end up becoming Creoles when they become the first language of a new urban generation of people. So if you want to understand the linguistic landscape of the world in the 21st century, if you want to understand global linguistic ecologies, language shift, and language endangerment, we have to look not just at languages like English, but we also have to look at languages like English-based Pidgins and Creoles, like Pisin. Thank you.